Hello class. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the nervous system, but in particular part of the central nervous system called the cerebral cortex. And if you were been reading in the book about the neurons and all, you know that neurons are nerve cells, and those nerve cells communicate with each other. Some of them are in bundles, and they make up all of our nerves. And to look at the nervous system, as you can see on the screen here, those nerves transmit information from our brain to our body and from our body to our brain, and the spinal cord is kind of the middleman there, which helps carry those messages to their destination. So the nervous system is really split into two major categories: the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. And the central nervous system is simply the brain and spinal cord. All the nerves that run peripheral to those are called the part of the peripheral nervous system. And you would, for the exam, you want to be familiar with the categories of the peripheral nervous system. So that is the autonomic nerves. Those are the nerves that control things automatically for us, so heartbeat, respiration, things of that nature. And sometimes when we're in situations that require action, our sympathetic nervous system kicks in, and that arouses our body. That would make your heartbeat faster. That would cause the blood flow to increase to various parts of your body, which would provide more oxygen to your cells and your brain, so you can think and act quickly, and to your muscles. And then when those events are over, the parasympathetic nervous system are those nerves that calm, send the messages to our organs to calm things back down again. Also part of the peripheral nervous system is the somatic nervous system, and oftentimes soma means body in a lot of contexts. So the somatic nervous system are the nerves that control all of your voluntary muscle movements. So all your body movements would be controlled by the nerves that make up your somatic nervous system. But what we really want to talk about more is the cortex. The cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the brain, and there are of course lots of parts of the brain underneath the cerebral cortex, but we're just focusing on this outer layer because in Introduction to Psychology we don't have to know all the parts of the brain. But we're going to focus on the outer layer because that's where the most sophisticated mental processing occurs. And as you can see from the image here, the cortex does have a left and a right hemisphere. They're joined together by a bundle of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum. And if you look at this image off to the right here, this is an image that shows how neurons are communicating with each other. And right in the middle you can see a lot of communication lines going back and forth, which is an indication that the left and the right hemispheres are communicating with each other, or the neurons in those hemispheres are communicating with each other. So there are three general areas in the cortex: the sensory input areas, which are parts of the cortex where the neurons process information from our sensory organs; the motor control areas, which are the parts of the cortex where the neurons control voluntary muscle movements; and the association areas where more sophisticated mental processing occurs. And so we're going to go through the cortex, which we divide into 4 lobes. Keep in mind that this is just like a map, not like physically separate areas of the brain. It's just like a map. And we do that just to create a common language of understanding. So when we're talking about the frontal lobe, people generally know that's the front part of the cortex. And you'd also want to keep in mind that you have a frontal lobe in both the left and right hemispheres, a parietal lobe in both the left and right. All 4 lobes are located in both hemispheres. So I'm going to go through each lobe and talk specifically about some of the major functions in each lobe. And this is organized, I think, a little bit more than the textbook. So this would probably be a good thing to review for the test, or maybe you even want to take some notes on it or whatever. So we start with the frontal lobe, and right here we're looking at the left hemisphere. So the frontal lobe is the area of the cortex in the front, and there's a couple of special areas here. So right at the back of the frontal lobe, in the very back part of the frontal lobe, which is demonstrated by this red area here, that's called the motor cortex, and those are the neurons that control all voluntary muscle movements. Because this is the left hemisphere, the neurons in this area of the cortex would control all voluntary muscle movements on the right side of the body. In addition to that special motor cortex, there's also a special area near that called Broca's area, named after the guy who discovered it, Paul Broca. And Broca's area is an area that specializes in speech production. So this would be coordinating the muscle movements required to produce speech sounds. If that Broca's area gets damaged due to stroke or some other form of brain injury, generally people will have difficulty speaking. But Broca's area is only in the left hemisphere for most people. So if you have a brain injury or stroke in the left hemisphere, you're more likely to have language impairments as a result of that. So what happens if you damage Broca's area is difficulty producing fluent speech, and that's called Broca's aphasia. And I'm going to show you a video of Broca's aphasia, and just kind of pay attention to the guy's speech and anything that you think seems kind of peculiar about that.
Hello, my name is Eddie Hennessy. I got a major stroke at 33.
Okay. So you might have noticed that Eddie's speech was kind of slow and methodical. Some of the sounds he did not pronounce correctly, like instead of 33, he said 33. So he's having difficulty coordinating the muscle movements to produce the TH sound. But that is kind of what Broca's aphasia is, and there's different degrees of severity. So sometimes that area gets damaged so badly that people literally can't really even speak much at all. But that would usually be not very typical, because that would be an enormous amount of damage. So, but anyway, the other thing in the frontal lobe are the association areas, and I'd like to point out that the association areas are where a lot of the more sophisticated mental processing occurs, as you can see on the slide in front of you. Thinking, motivation, planning, controlling your emotions, or regulating your emotions is all part in the frontal lobe. So the association areas would be anywhere in the frontal lobe where there aren't highly specialized areas. So for example, the motor cortex is a highly specialized area. Broca's area is a highly specialized area. But then there's a lot of area in front of that, all this area in the front of the frontal lobe, where that's what we would call the association areas. That's where a lot of your thinking and planning and processing information like that occurs. So if you were to remove the motor cortex, which is, again, that's the strip of neurons in the cortex that controls all voluntary muscle movements, we can actually map that out to a fairly accurate degree. Pretty standard that, for example, the neurons that move the lips are generally in this kind of area. Neurons that move the ankles are in the back part over here. And you'll notice that the image is kind of odd looking. The body parts aren't proportional. Same thing with the sculpture down here that says motor on it. The hands are huge, and the lips and the tongue are huge compared to other parts of the body. Well, the reason that it looks like that is because the sculpture in the image up here, they are proportional to the amount of cortex devoted to them. So the reason the hands look so big here is because a significant portion of the motor cortex is devoted to moving the hands, which makes sense because we have lots of little muscles that have to be moved in unique ways to grab things with our fingers and such. So it requires a lot of muscle coordination. The lips are large too because there are a lot of muscles that you have to move in unique ways to move your lips in specific ways to help speech sounds. So because you have a lot of muscles that need to be moved, you need a lot of neurons in the cortex to direct the movement of those muscles. And that's why this image is so odd looking. So the next lobe is right behind the frontal lobe, and it's called the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe has a specialized area in it as well, called the sensory cortex, or sometimes called the somatosensory cortex. And the sensory cortex is where information from all of our skin senses are processed. So things like touch, pressure, pain, temperature, things of that nature. And of course, again, we're looking at the left cortex. So this strip where I'm moving my mouse is the sensory cortex, and that would be the cortex that's receiving information from the skin senses on the right side of the body. And much like the motor cortex, different parts of the body are more sensitive to touch than others. So for example, your hands, the skin and the layers of your hands have a lot of neurons that detect touch and temperature. And because of that, we need a lot of neurons in the cortex to process that information. So if you were to sculpt the body proportional to the amount of cortex devoted to it in terms of your skin senses, it looks a lot like the motor cortex because those areas of the body that are most sensitive are larger on the sculpture, tongue, lips, hand, because there's more neurons in the skin that process that information, and there's more neurons in the cortex to receive that information. Some other things that occur in the parietal lobe would be awareness of body position, spatial orientation, and your sense of direction. So I kind of think of that as like if you're in a familiar environment, like let's say you're driving your car and you always keep a box of Kleenex behind the driver's seat. You can reach back there and grab that pretty easily without looking, and that's because of your awareness of body position and where things are in relation to your body. And that's something we probably take for granted, because we don't even consciously think about that stuff when we do it. But we generally know like how to direct the muscle movements to reach things like that without having to directly look at it. Other areas in the parietal lobe, like the association areas, would store information for how objects feel, which is another thing we take for granted. There are some people who are unable to store memories for how things feel, and they literally could put their hand in their front pocket, and if their car key was in their front pocket, they would not be able to identify that by touch. They would have no idea what they're touching. Not until they take it out of their pocket and actually look at it, then they would be able to identify it because of their visual memory, which is in a different part of